There is something quietly provocative about an empty chair. It suggests invitation, possibility, ownership. Now, imagine a chair in the corner of a rural English pub. Nothing ornate, nothing royal, just wood, worn smooth by years of use. And yet everyone in the room knows, do not sit in that one. Not because it will break, not because it belongs to someone important, but because the last people who sat there died. Some quickly, some violently, some in accidents that, on paper, had nothing to do with furniture. But the pattern remained, and the story hardened. This is not just a tale of a cursed object. It is the story of anger, pride, rural power, execution, folklore, coincidence, and how a single sentence spoken before death can echo for centuries. Welcome back to the Eclectic, where we sit with the stories that refuse to sit quietly. Tonight, we're not exploring a haunted house, we're not following a serial killer. We're examining something more intimate. A chair, a man, and a murder. And a curse that may not need to be real in order to work. Thirsk in the 1700s. To understand Thomas Busby, we need to step back into the 18th century in North Yorkshire. Thirsk was not a dramatic place. It was agricultural, close-knit, economically modest, and socially rigid. Reputation was currency, authority was local, disputes were personal. And in a rural community, land mattered, marriage mattered, and inheritance mattered. And seating, especially in taverns, mattered more than you might expect, because a tavern wasn't just a drinking house. It was a meeting place, a trading hub, a negotiation room, a power map. Where you sat signalled who you were, and one particular seat in one particular inn belonged to Thomas Busby. Thomas Busby was not aristocracy, he was not clergy, and he was not a gentleman farmer. He was a tradesman, reportedly a carpenter or a cabinet maker, which makes the chair even more symbolic. If Busby built furniture, then a chair was not just wood. It was craft, it was identity, it was status in a modest world. Contemporary descriptions suggest Busby was volatile, not necessarily monstrous, but territorial, defensive, easily angered. And in small communities, that temperament grows teeth, because every disagreement repeats, every slight is remembered, and every insult becomes cumulative. Busby married Elizabeth Bess Orty. Her father, Daniel Orty, owned or ran a local inn, later associated with what became known as Busby Stoop Inn. Orty was older, established, property holding. Busby married into something he did not fully control, and that mattered. There are conflicting accounts about the relationship between Busby and his father-in-law. Some say they worked together, some say they clashed constantly. But this much is consistent. They argued, often, and over time those arguments grew sharper. Now picture it. An older innkeeper, a younger, temperamental son-in-law. Both men proud, both men territorial. In rural England in the 1700s, legal mediation wasn't swift or subtle. Disputes festered. If Daniel Orty controlled the property, the inn, the land, the space, then Busby's authority was conditional, and conditional authority breeds resentment, especially in men who equate possession with power. In 1702, the conflict reached its breaking point. Historical court records confirmed that Daniel Orty was murdered, bludgeoned. Accounts suggest the killing occurred following a heated confrontation, possibly in or near the inn itself. One version says Orty sat in Busby's chair. Another suggests a more general quarrel escalated. Either way, violence followed. Busby killed his father-in-law, not in secrecy, not by poison, not by stealth, but directly, blunt force. an act that suggests rage rather than calculation, and that distinction is important because rage leaves emotional residue, and emotional residue feeds folklore. To understand Thomas Busby, we have to understand what Yorkshire was like in 1702. Because in the early 18th century, rural England was not pastoral and gentle. It was hard. Violence was not rare, and authority was uneven. Justice was swift, but not always precise. North Yorkshire at the turn of the 18th century was a patchwork of farms, inns, toll roads, and market towns. Travel was slow, law enforcement was local, policing, as we understand it today, didn't exist. There were no professional detectives, no forensic science, and no structured criminal investigation units. Crime was dealt with through the local magistrates, the parish constables, and the assizes courts. Justice depended heavily on witness testimony and reputation. And reputation did matter enormously. If you were known to be quarrelsome, violent, or dishonest, that reputation followed you into the court. The Bloody Code, the system under which dozens of crimes carried the death penalty, would expand later in the 18th century. But even in 1702, capital punishment was a common sentence for serious offences. Murder was unequivocally a hanging offence. There was no life imprisonment, no appeals process in the modern sense, no forensic reconsideration. If convicted, you would hang. Executions were public, and deliberately so. In 1702, execution, as I said, was not hidden. It was theatre. Condemned prisoners were typically taken to the gallows in a cart. The journey itself was part of the ritual. Crowds gathered. Vendors sold food and drink. Sermons were sometimes preached at the site. The purpose was deterrence, but it was also moral instruction. The condemned were expected to confess, express remorse, acknowledge divine justice, warn others. It was a performance. If Thomas Busby truly uttered a curse instead of repentance, that would have been deeply transgressive, because it inverted the ritual. Instead of humility, defiance. Instead of repentance, ownership. And instead of submission, warning. And that would have stayed in people's memories, even if it was embellished later. After the execution, bodies were sometimes displayed. In particularly serious cases, criminals could be gibbeted, hung in chains as a warning to others. While there is no solid record that Busby was gibbeted, the location name, Busby Stoop, suggests his body may have been displayed near the road after execution. A stoop, often referred to as a post or marker. If his corpse was exhibited along a highway, it would have served as a physical reminder of state power. And in small rural communities, that image would have lingered. Public execution was not simply punishment, it was social messaging. Now consider the setting, the Busby Stoop Inn. Alehouses in the 17th and early 18th centuries were central to rural life. They were, as we have said before, drinking establishments. They were trading hubs, informal courts, to say, employment exchanges, and rumour mills. They were also sites of violence. Fights were common. Alcohol lowered restraint. Disputes over land, money, or family frequently escalated. A quarrel turning deadly inside or near an inn would not have shocked locals. But murdering your father-in-law? That crossed a line. Because kinship obligations were sacred in rural society, family was survival. To kill within that structure was not just a crime, it was betrayal. Blunt force trauma killings were tragically common in early modern England. Firearms existed, but they were expensive and unreliable. Knives were common tools, but also common weapons. Clubs, axes, farm implements, these were everyday objects that could become lethal. If Busby killed Daniel Orty in anger, using what was at hand, it would align with the violence of the period. It was intimate, personal, physical. and that physicality made such crimes emotionally resonant. People remembered them. Yorkshire villages in 1702 did not rely on newspapers for news. They relied on repetition. Stories were told in churches, in inns, in fields. Events were narrated, exaggerated, moralized. Over decades, details shift. Dialogue is invented, dramatic lines are added, and curses become quotable. If Busby did say something defiant, even something minor, it could easily have evolved into, "May death come swiftly to anyone who sits in my chair." That phrasing may not be verbatim history, but it fits the pattern of oral escalation. Folklore doesn't fabricate from nothing. It grows from fragments. Early 18th century England still straddled superstition and emerging rationalism. Belief in witchcraft, though declining legally, omens, divine punishment, cursed objects. It was not fringe thinking. If a condemned man cursed something publicly, listeners would not automatically dismiss it, especially if misfortune later coincided with the object. The Enlightenment did not erase superstition overnight. It coexisted with it, and rural areas often held onto belief systems longer than urban centres. Yorkshire in 1702 was not London in 1702. It was slower to change, more tradition-bound, more memory-driven. And here's something important. Curses serve a purpose. They reinforce moral boundaries, punishment transgressions symbolically, preserve stories, and keep the dead socially active. A cursed chair in an inn does something subtle. It keeps the story of Thomas Busby alive. It prevents trivialization. It transforms furniture into warning. And that transformation helps communities process violence. Rather than say, a man murdered his father-in-law, the narrative becomes, he was so wicked that even his chair carries death. That is myth-making. But it is also social containment. It turns chaos into a cautionary tale. Busby did not escape justice. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Execution in the early 18th century England was not quiet. It was public, it was performative, and it was moral theatre. Hanging was intended not just as a punishment, but as a warning. As said previously, bodies were sometimes displayed in gibbets near crime scenes as deterrents, and Thomas Busby's execution followed that pattern. He was hanged near the site of his crime. His body displayed, his name attached permanently to that place, which is how Busby Stoop, the roadside marker near Thirsk, entered local geography. Execution transforms private anger into public memory, but what sealed the legend was not the murder. It was what Busby allegedly said before he died. According to later retellings, Thomas Busby declared, "May sudden death come to anyone who dares sit in my chair." We cannot verify those exact words. Execution transcripts from the period are incomplete, but the sentiment persisted. And that persistence matters more than accuracy, because curses function symbolically. They are emotional anchors, and Busby's chair became an anchor point for unresolved tension. The chair represents rest, authority, possession. Busby could no longer control the inn, but he could claim the seat. And in claiming it, he attached consequence to it. For decades, nothing dramatic happened, or at least nothing recorded. The chair remained in use at the inn. But slowly, stories accumulated. A labourer sits in the chair. Later, he dies in a quarry accident. A visitor sits in the chair, dies in a road collision. A soldier on leave sits in the chair, does not return from war. Are these connected? No. Are they narratively irresistible? Absolutely, because coincidence becomes pattern the moment we assign it meaning. And the moment three stories align, folklore activates. By the mid-20th century, the Busby chair was no longer furniture. It was folklore. And folklore is stronger than fact, because fact requires evidence. Folklore requires only repetition. In the next section, we'll examine the deaths more closely, the patterns, the psychology, the turning point that forced the inn to remove the chair from public use. And we'll ask a harder question. Did the chair kill anyone? Or did belief do the work? Legends don't begin with one death. They begin with three. 3 is the threshold. 1 is tragedy. 2 is coincidence. 3 is a pattern. By the mid-20th century, Thomas Busby's chair had crossed that threshold. And once people begin looking for patterns, they find them everywhere. Let's pause before listing names, because if we're going to understand the Busby chair properly, we need to understand how curses work. Curses don't operate through magic. They operate through narrative reinforcement. Here's how it happens. An event occurs. A story links it to a symbolic object. The story is repeated. Future events are filtered through that expectation. The Busby chair became a container, and over time it collected stories. Some were vague, some were local gossip, some were probably embellished after the fact, but repetition hardened them, and repetition builds belief. The most widely circulated accounts involve RAF personnel during the Second World War. The Busby Stoop Inn was frequented by servicemen stationed nearby. The story goes that airmen who sat in the chair would die on subsequent missions. Now let's ground this. Bomber crews during World War II had staggeringly high casualty rates. Survival beyond 30 missions was statistically unlikely. So, if several airmen who visited the pub later died, that would not be unusual. But the mind does not calculate wartime probability. It remembers symbols. And so the narrative formed. They sat in Busby's chair. They did not come back. The chair was blamed. Not the Luftwaffe, not mechanical failure, not anti-aircraft fire. The chair. This is not stupidity. This is psychology. In environments of high risk, humans look for controllable variables. If you cannot control enemy fire, you can avoid a chair. Avoidance creates safety theatre, and safety theatre spreads quickly. After the war, the legend did not fade. It expanded. Various accounts, some recorded, some anecdotal, describe the following. A lorry driver sits in the chair before leaving. He later crashes and dies. A bricklayer ignores the warning, falls from scaffolding days later. A visiting labourer mocks the superstition, dies in an industrial accident. Now here's what matters. None of these deaths were immediate. The chair did not collapse, it did not splinter, it did not cause physical injury. The consequences were external, delayed, which is exactly how curses survive scrutiny. Because if someone dies later, causality becomes interpretive. Was the accident caused by the chair, or was it coincidence? Believers say the chair marked them. Skeptics say life is dangerous. And the argument never resolves. By the 1960s and 70s, the chair had become an attraction. Some visitors came specifically to sit in it, to defy it, to laugh at it, which introduces an interesting twist. Once a curse becomes famous, it attracts challengers, and challengers create more potential evidence. Because if even one challenger later dies, for any reason, the legend strengthens. The landlord repeatedly began noticing something else. Not just deaths, but discomfort. Regulars avoided the chair. Staff avoided the chair. Even skeptics hesitated. That hesitation is powerful. Because even when we don't believe in something, we rarely tempt it deliberately, especially when the cost appears symbolic, but the risk feels real. And so, eventually, the landlord removed the chair from ordinary use, not because it had proven lethal, but because belief had made it socially volatile. One of the most frequently cited last incidents involves a delivery driver. The story says he sat in the chair, joked about the curse, left the pub, and later died in a traffic accident. Again, this is the kind of narrative that cements folklore, because it contains all the necessary components: dismissal of the warning, public bravado, and sudden death. It reads like morality theatre, and morality theatre is how rural legends sustain themselves. Was this even documented thoroughly? Not to modern evidentiary standards, but documentation isn't what makes a legend endure. Retelling it does. And by the time enough stories accumulated, the pub owner made a decision that changed everything. The chair was donated to the Thirsk Museum. But here's the key detail. It wasn't simply placed in storage. It was mounted high on a wall, out of reach, out of use. Not just preserved, elevated. Which is symbolically perfect, because elevation turns object into relic. You don't sit on relics, you observe them. And by placing the chair beyond physical interaction, the museum froze the legend. It can no longer be tested. It can no longer collect new stories. It exists now as contained folklore, safe, but still ominous. Here's an interesting psychological question. If the curse is nonsense, why doesn't someone simply sit in it now? Why not remove it from the wall, sit publicly, and document survival? Here's why. Because superstition operates differently than logic. It doesn't demand belief. It only demands uncertainty. And very few people are willing to risk becoming the anecdote. Even hardened skeptics hesitate when consequence feels personal. You can mock a curse abstractly. It's harder to mock it physically, especially when the cost, if you're wrong, feels existential. Let's apply statistical reality. Thousands of people likely sat in that chair over 2 centuries. Only a handful of associated deaths are remembered, which means the vast majority of sitters lived normal lives, but survival stories are not retold. No one says, Arthur sat in a chair and lived to 82, because survival does not support the narrative. Selection bias fuels curse mythology. We remember confirming cases, we forget neutral ones. Over time, the neutral majority disappears, and the pattern looks more compelling than it is. Now let's return to Busby himself. If he truly uttered a curse before execution, what does that suggest? Execution in 1702 was public humiliation, a stripping of status, a loss of control, a forced surrender. For a territorial man, that would be devastating. Cursing the chair reasserts ownership. It says, you can hang me, you can display me, but this remains mine. It transforms defeat into legacy, and whether Busby believed in the curse is irrelevant, because belief is not required for myth to function. Intent is enough. Why do certain objects attract curse legends? Chairs, mirrors, paintings, jewellery? Well, because they are intimate. A chair holds the body. It supports weight. It occupies shared space. Sitting is vulnerable. You lower yourself. You settle. And so attaching danger to a chair attaches danger to vulnerability. The Busby chair isn't frightening because it's ornate. It's frightening because it's ordinary. And ordinary objects turned dangerous unsettle us the most. By the time the chair was mounted on the museum wall, the legend was complete. Not proven, not disproven, complete. Thomas Busby had killed a man. He had been executed, and centuries later his seat still carried consequence. But in the next part we go deeper. We examine whether any historical documentation supports the curse, how folklore evolves when crime and pride collide, and whether the most dangerous element was never the chair, but the story attached to it. Because sometimes what kills isn't wood, it's belief. Today, the chair hangs high on the wall in the Thirsk Museum. It's out of reach. It's not roped off dramatically, and it's not placed under Gothic lighting. It's just mounted. Still and ordinary. You can stand beneath it, you can photograph it. You can squint at its joints and wonder what exactly about it once terrified people. But you cannot sit in it. And that final detail matters, because the power of the Busby chair was never in how it looked. It was in what it invited people to do. Let's separate documentation from legend. What do we actually know? Thomas Busby was executed in 1702 for the murder of Daniel Orty. A chair associated with Busby existed in the Busby Stoop Inn. The chair was later donated to the Thirsk Museum. A curse story became attached to it. What we do not have is a contemporary written account of Busby uttering a curse at execution. Official records linking specific documented deaths directly to the chair. 18th century newspapers describing supernatural element. The curse appears to have solidified later, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that is important, because folklore often retrofits drama onto real events. The murder was real, the execution was real. The curse may have been memory reshaped. Stage 1, a crime happens. Stage 2, colourful detail is added. Stage 3, that detail is repeated until it becomes foundational. Stage 4, the story is retold as fact. By the time the Busby chair entered wider awareness, the curse was inseparable from the object. And once an object becomes symbolically charged, it begins attracting narrative gravity. If someone who sat in the chair died years later, even in unrelated circumstances, the story would attach. If someone mocked the curse and then experienced misfortune, the story would attach. Folklore thrives on retrospective thinking. Humans are exceptional pattern makers. We connect dots instinctively, even when those dots are random. Here's something deeply human. We struggle with the idea that evil simply ends. We want residue. We want imprint. We want something left behind. It's emotionally unsatisfying to think Thomas Busby committed murder, was executed, and then vanished into dust. The cursed chair feels narratively complete. It suggests that violence lingers, that acts echo, that places remember. But this desire for the continuity can distort reality. Objects do not absorb morality, but we behave as if they do, and behaviour shapes experience. Think about the social mechanics at play inside that pub. A newcomer enters. They see an old chair. Someone says, "That's Busby's, don't sit there." Now we have tension. If they avoid it, the story wins quietly. If they sit in it, the story gains risk. If nothing happens, no one talks about it. If something happens, even unrelated, it becomes confirmation. The curse operates through permission. The chair itself does nothing. But sitting in it becomes an act of defiance. And defiance is emotionally charged. The emotional charge is what people remember. Here's where things get psychologically interesting. When someone believes they may have done something dangerous, their behaviour can shift subtly. Increased anxiety, heightened stress, distracted attention. If a man leaves the pub shaken by the story, even if he mocks it and drives home distracted, is the chair involved? Not supernaturally, but cognitively? Possibly. Fear alters physiology. It affects reaction times. It influences decision-making. A curse doesn't need magic. It only needs psychological leverage. The pub landlord's decision to remove the chair wasn't an admission of supernatural belief. It was an act of social management. When an object becomes controversial, it stops being furniture. It becomes liability. Removing the chair did three things. 1. It stopped further tests. 2. It preserved the legend. And 3. It avoided future association. Ironically, mounting the chair in a museum may have saved the legend from collapse, because once removed from active life, it could no longer fail. No one could sit in it and disprove the curse. It entered suspended animation, and legends thrive in suspension. Let's return to 1702. Public executions were theatre. They were moral demonstrations. The condemned were expected to confess, repent, and submit. If Thomas Busby instead cursed his chair, as we've asked before, whether theatrically or angrily, he inverted that script. Instead of humility, he asserted possession. Instead of repentance, he offered warning. That is narratively irresistible, because it transforms a criminal into a myth maker. The curse, real or imagined, restores agency, and agency is compelling. The Busby chair fits into a broader cultural pattern. Across history, certain objects attract lethal reputations. The Hope Diamond, the Dybbuk box, the Crying Boy paintings, the Annabelle doll. In every case, the object has a dramatic origin story. A series of misfortunes are selectively attached. Media amplification increases exposure. Skeptical testing rarely occurs publicly. The Busby chair predates viral media, but functions identically. It is an analogue folklore in physical form. So why does the Busby chair endure when so many rural legends fade? Because it contains three potent ingredients: murder, execution, and ownership. Busby did not curse a random item. He cursed his chair. Personal property. That specifically gives the legend spine. And the fact that the chair still exists gives the legend body. Most cursed objects are lost to time. This one can still be seen. That visibility sustains belief. If we strip away the supernatural layer, what remains? A man murdered his father-in-law. He was executed. His name survived. The chair survived. And generations layered narrative onto both. The chair is not haunted by death. It is haunted by storytelling. And storytelling is powerful. It shapes behaviour. It influences perception. It alters risk assessment. It changes how we move through space. The Busby chair demonstrates something profound. Humans will imbue wood with moral memory. Not because wood demands it, but because we do. If you stood beneath the Busby chair today, nothing would happen. No cold hand, no whisper, no sudden dread. Just wood. And yet, very few people would ask to sit in it. That hesitation is the legend's true victory. Thomas Busby may never have uttered a curse, but someone did, and enough people repeated it, and repetition built fear, and fear built narrative, and narrative built endurance. The chair doesn't kill, but the story refuses to die. Perhaps that is the more interesting phenomenon, because curses are rarely about the object. They are about control, about legacy, about refusing to disappear. Thomas Busby was executed in 1702. 3 centuries later, people still speak his name, not because of the murder, but because of the chair. And that may be the final irony. The curse, real or imagined, work. This has been The Eclectic, a story not just about a murder in 1702, but about the way objects gather myth, how fear attaches to wood, and how narrative can outlive the body. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.